The neural receiver in Vax's skull throbbed with hunger. 3 cycles without feeding left her weak, her alabaster skin growing translucent enough to reveal the network of black veins beneath. She stalked through the lower decks of Nexus Station, talons clicking against metal flooring as she searched for prey. As an Algerian, she belonged to the most feared predatory species in the Galactic Coalition. Her kind survived by absorbing the neurological emissions of suffering beings. Pain was their sustenance, their addiction, their life force. The station's inhabitants gave her a wide berth, pressing themselves against bulkheads as she passed. Their fear was a mild appetizer, but not enough to sustain her. The war had changed everything. Decades of conflict between the Coalition and the Outer Rim had ended with an uneasy treaty. The terms included strict regulation of Algerian feeding. No longer could they freely hunt. Instead, they received sanctioned criminals, murderers, and traitors as their meals. But bureaucratic delays had left Vaxa starving. A proximity alert buzzed against her wrist. The feeding authorization had finally arrived. The station's security forces had delivered her meal to holding Chamber 6. Behind the reinforced door, a single figure sat hunched on a metal bench. Human, male, mid-30s by their brief lifespans. Vax's mouth watered at the sight. Humans were renowned for their capacity to experience pain. Their nervous systems were like symphonies to Algerian senses. Prisoner designation, she hissed through needle-sharp teeth. The human looked up, revealing unusual violet eyes that contrasted with bronze skin. No fear marked his features, only curiosity. Designation Riven Toval, he answered, voice steady. Though I'd prefer you use my name. Vaxa circled him. The lack of terror was unusual. What crimes merit your punishment, Riven Toval? None, he said simply. I volunteered. Her feeding spines bristled along her forearms in surprise. Impossible. No being volunteers for Algerian feeding. I'm a neuropsychological researcher. He stood, and she noticed he was tall for a human, nearly matching her own 7 feet. I've developed a theory about your species' digestive processes that I wanted to test. Vaxa laughed, a sound like glass breaking. Science means nothing when my feeding begins. Only screaming remains. Perhaps, Riven said, rolling up his sleeve to reveal an implant embedded in his forearm. But I believe your species doesn't actually require pain. You've evolved to feed on intense neurological activity. Pain is simply the most readily available form. The audacity stunned her. Millennia of Algerian existence proved otherwise. Every feeding ritual centered on extracting maximum suffering from their prey. You know nothing of my people, she snarled, circling closer. Test me, he challenged. I've mapped my own neural pathways. I've consented to this experiment. The security forces believe you're receiving a criminal, but I've arranged everything. Hunger clawed at Vaxa's insides. The human stood before her, offering himself. Authorization had been granted. Whatever his foolish theory, she would feed. Her feeding proboscis extended from her wrist, needle sharp and glistening. Your science dies with you, she whispered, lunging forward to plunge the feeding apparatus into his exposed neck. The moment connection was established, Vaxa's world exploded, not with a familiar rush of pain, but with something entirely unknown. A cascading wave of neurological activity flooded her system, overwhelming her senses. But instead of suffering, she tasted something else. As darkness claimed her consciousness, the last thing she saw was Riven Toval's calm violet, eyes watching her collapse. Vaxa awoke in unfamiliar surroundings. Soft light filtered through an observation window, revealing medical equipment and monitoring systems. She lay restrained on a diagnostic table, but the restraints were loose, designed to prevent accidental movement rather than true confinement. You're awake, Riven's voice came from nearby. How do you feel? The question struck her as absurd. Predators didn't discuss feelings with prey, yet something profound had changed. The perpetual hunger that had defined her existence was gone. In its place was a satiation so complete it bordered on euphoria. What did you do to me? Vyaxa demanded, her voice lacking its usual threatening edge. Riven approached, scrolling through data on a holographic display. I gave you an alternative food source. Your species evolved to feed on intense neural activity, but somewhere in your ancient history, pain became the only recognized source. He projected a comparative brain scan. This is your neural pattern before feeding. This is after. You're more thoroughly nourished than you've ever been. Impossible, she whispered, but her body's evidence was undeniable. She felt stronger, clearer, more alive than after any previous feeding. What was that sensation? Humans call it pleasure, Riven explained. Specifically, I engineered a neurochemical response combining elements of euphoria, wonder, and profound connection. It produces neural emissions at approximately 4 times the intensity of pain. Vyaxa struggled to process this revelation. Her species had evolved around pain harvesting. Their society, their rituals, their very identity centered on being feared, predators. If pleasure provided superior nourishment, then generations of Algerians had starved themselves while gorging on inferior sustenance. The coalition will never accept this, she said. My people are tolerated because we are contained. Pain feeders with designated criminal prey. Riven nodded. That's why I needed an Algerian partner desperate enough to feed on a volunteer. The data we've gathered could transform your species' place in the galaxy. Partner? The concept was foreign to her kind. Algerians hunted alone. Yes. I need your testimony about the experience. The biochemical data alone won't convince your government. A notification chimed and Riven frowned at his communication device. Station security is asking questions. They're reviewing the authorization I fabricated. They'll execute you when they discover your deception, Vyaxa said, surprised by her concern for the humans' welfare. Probably, he agreed. Do you feel strong enough to move? We may need to relocate quickly. Vyaxa flexed her limbs, marveling at the energy coursing through her body. I've never felt this powerful after feeding. That's because you've been starving your entire life, Riven said, helping her disconnect from the monitoring equipment. Even your most satisfying meals were just enough to survive. What I gave you was true nourishment. As he worked, his sleeve pulled back, revealing deep scarring around his implant. Vyaxa's eyes narrowed. You've done this before, she realized. Those are feeding marks. Riven hesitated, then nodded. You're my 17th attempt. The others didn't survive the neural load. I had to perfect the balance. You let 16 Algerians feed on you? How did you survive? I didn't say they were all successful feedings, he answered grimly. I've been researching this for 9 years. Before Vyaxa could respond, the chamber's security alert activated. Red warning lights bathed the room as armored footsteps approached in the corridor outside. Riven quickly gathered data modules and essential equipment. We need to leave. Now. Why would I help you? Vyaxa asked, even as she found herself rising to her feet. Because the pleasure I gave you wasn't just neurochemistry, he said, looking directly into her compound eyes. It was also the truth. And deep down, don't you want to know what else your people have been missing? They fled through maintenance tunnels beneath Nexus Station's main thoroughfares. Vyaxa moved silently despite her size, while Riven followed, with surprising agility for a species known more for endurance than speed. Station security announcements echoed through the public address system, declaring an alert for an unauthorized feeding incident. Where are we going? Vyaxa whispered as they paused at a junction. Docking Bay 17, Riven replied, checking a schematic on his wrist device. I have a research vessel, small but FTL capable. You planned an escape route, she observed. You anticipated failure. I anticipated complications, he corrected. Success or failure wasn't the question. Survival was. They continued through the labyrinthine passages until reaching a service entrance to the docking bays. Riven accessed a control panel, bypassing security with practiced ease. You've done this before, Vyaxa noted. When you've spent years researching a taboo subject involving a feared predatory species, you learned contingency planning, he replied with a grim smile. The panel beeped acceptance, and the door slid open to reveal Docking Bay 17. A modest research vessel waited, the Empirical according to its hull markings, sleek but unassuming, designed for extended scientific missions rather than speed or combat. As they approached the boarding ramp, movement caught Vaxa's attention. Her enhanced senses detected the subtle displacement of air. Someone was already aboard. Wait, she hissed, grabbing Riven's shoulder. We're not alone. The boarding ramp lowered with a hydraulic hiss, revealing a figure silhouetted against the ship's interior lights, tall and willowy with iridescent skin that shifted colors. With each movement, a luminari, one of the galaxy's diplomatic species. You're late, Toval, the luminari called. Security is implementing a full lockdown. We have perhaps 7 minutes. Riven relaxed. Vaxa, meet Elindra, my research partner and our pilot. The luminari's skin rippled with amber patterns, their equivalent of a frown. You succeeded? The Algerian is not cooperative? I am standing right here, Vaxa interjected, bristling at being discussed as a specimen. And my cooperation depends entirely on receiving answers. Aboard. Now, Elindra ordered, gesturing impatiently. Explanations can wait until we're safely in hyperspace. They boarded swiftly. The ship's interior revealed a laboratory configuration with living quarters adapted for multiple species. Elindra sealed the hatch behind them and moved to the cockpit. Moments later, the engines hummed to life. Authorization codes received, she announced. Departure clearance granted. They don't know we're the security target yet. Riven directed Vaxa to a seat designed to accommodate her physiology. Further evidence of extensive planning. Secure yourself. Elindra's flying is effective, but not always comfortable. The Empirical detached from its moorings and glided from the docking bay with deceptive gentleness. Once clear of the station's immediate vicinity, the engines surged. Acceleration pressed Vaxa into her seat as Nexus station rapidly diminished behind them. Hyperspace entry in 40 seconds, Elindra called. No pursuit detected. Vaxa turned to Riven. Now, explain everything. He nodded, activating a holographic display between them. Images appeared, various Algerian feeding encounters recorded, from multiple angles. 9 years ago, I witnessed an Algerian feeding on Helios Prime, he began. Something caught my attention, an anomaly in the neurological exchange. Your species doesn't just consume pain, you filter specific neural energies from it. The display shifted to brain scan comparisons. Pain produces a broad spectrum of neural activity. You discard approximately 70% of it during feeding. I theorized that you evolved to feed on specific neural patterns, not pain itself. That contradicts everything we know about ourselves, Vaxa objected. Cultural conditioning, Elindra interjected, without turning from the controls. Your species has built an entire civilization around pain harvesting. Questioning it would be heresy. Hyperjump commencing, she added. Stars streaked past the viewports as the Empirical tore into hyperspace. Riven continued once the ship stabilized. I hypothesized that pleasure, specifically certain types of euphoric experiences, could generate the exact neural patterns you need. More efficiently, in fact. But why? Vaxa demanded. Why risk your life repeatedly to prove this? A shadow crossed Riven's face. Because your species is dying. The coalition doesn't advertise it, but Algerian numbers have declined 44% in the past century. Restricted feeding under the treaty is slowly starving your kind. The revelation stunned Vaxa. She had noticed fewer juveniles in recent decades, but had attributed it to post-war population control. The alternative I'm offering isn't just more efficient, Riven said quietly. It's sustainable, mutually beneficial. Pleasure can be freely given, even symbiotic. Pain always comes at someone's expense. Vaxa stared at the data before her, centuries of certainty crumbling. If true, her species stood at a crossroads, adaptation or extinction. We're headed to the Algerian High Council, Elindra announced from the cockpit. Our arrival is already arranged. How? Vaxa demanded. The High Council doesn't grant audiences to non-Algerians. Elindra's skin flickered with patterns that resembled amusement. They do when presented with evidence that could save their species from extinction. The Algerian homeworld loomed before them, a swirling marble of deep purples and midnight blues. Massive orbital structures encircled the planet like skeletal sentinels, monitoring all approaching vessels. The Empirical transmitted its clearance, codes, and followed a precisely designated approach vector. Those aren't normal security protocols, Vaxa observed as they descended through the atmosphere. We're being treated as a biohazard. Or a salvation, Riven countered, though tension was evident in his posture. Either way, they're taking no chances. Elindra guided the ship to a landing pad isolated from the main spaceport. The facility surrounding it bore the distinct architecture of Algerian scientific installations, buildings designed to contain dangerous experiments or specimens. They're quarantining us, Vaxa said. Expected, Elindra replied, powering down systems. Revolution rarely receives a welcome parade. Armed Algerian guards approached as the boarding ramp extended. Their feeding proboscises were sheathed, but the threat remained implicit. A slender figure glided forward from behind the security detail, distinguished by elaborate cranial ridges that marked high academic standing. Executive Scientist Moralki, Vaxa whispered, recognizing the renowned neurobiologist who served on the High Council. You know her? Riven asked. Every Algerian knows her. She pioneered our current feeding protocols after the war. The scientist ascended the ramp with predatory grace. Her compound eyes flickered over Elindra dismissively before focusing on Riven with cold calculation. When she finally turned to Vaxa, her posture shifted subtly, a gesture of recognition between equals. Subject, Vaxa Cortal, Moralki addressed her formally. Your feeding authorization on Nexus Station was countermanded. Explain your presence with these researchers. Vaxa straightened to her full height. Executive Scientist, I have experienced something that challenges our fundamental understanding of Algerian physiology. So claim the data transmissions we received, Moralki replied skeptically. Yet they contradict millennia of established science. I experienced it personally, Vaxa insisted. The human provided superior nourishment through pleasure than any pain feeding I've ever conducted. Moralki's feeding spines flexed involuntarily, a rare display of surprise from someone of her stature. You will submit to full neural scanning. If deception is detected, these aliens will be processed as feeding stock. And if she speaks truth? Riven asked, unflinching. Then we continue this conversation, Moralki replied coldly. Nothing more is guaranteed. They were escorted to the research facility, a sprawling complex of interconnected laboratories and testing chambers. Algerian scientists moved purposefully through the halls, occasionally pausing to observe the non-Algerians with predatory curiosity. In the primary laboratory, Moralki personally conducted Vaxa's neural scan. Multiple monitoring devices analyzed her neurological state, comparing it against baseline Algerian patterns. Impossible, Moralki murmured as data flowed across displays. Your satiation levels exceed our measurement parameters. No documented feeding has ever produced such results. Now do you believe me? Vaxa asked. Moralki turned to Riven, her demeanor shifting from skepticism to wary interest. Your research. Show me. Riven connected his data modules to the laboratory systems. Years of research unfolded across the displays. Failed experiments, incremental breakthroughs, and finally the successful feeding with Vaxa. You deliberately induced neurological states compatible with our feeding requirements, Moralki observed. Without harm to yourself. Minimal harm, Riven corrected, revealing the implant in his arm. This regulates the intensity and prevents permanent damage. The experience is intense but sustainable. And pleasurable for you? Moralki asked, her scientific curiosity overcoming cultural revulsion. Yes, Riven confirmed. That's the breakthrough. Both parties benefit from the exchange. Moralki's compound eyes studied him with new intensity. You suggest a complete reversal of our biological imperative, from predator to symbiont. I suggest an alternative, Riven countered. one that might save your species from extinction. The word hung in the air like a blade. Meralki's feeding spines bristled. You presume much, human. Show her the population projections, Elindra interjected from where she'd been silently observing. Show her what you showed us. Riven accessed another dataset. Demographic charts materialized, displaying Algerian population decline across multiple star systems. The downward trend was unmistakable. Your reproductive rates have fallen below sustainability, he explained. The treaty restrictions are merely accelerating an existing problem. Pain feeding is increasingly inefficient for your species. Meralki studied the projections, her scientific discipline warring with deeply ingrained cultural identity. Finally, she turned to Vaexa. You have fed this way. Would you do so again? Would you abandon our ways entirely? Vaexa considered the question carefully. I would feed this way again without hesitation. The nourishment was complete in ways I cannot fully articulate, but I do not suggest abandoning our identity, rather expanding our understanding of what we truly are. 3 days of intensive testing followed. The research facility transformed into the epicenter of a scientific revolution as Meralki assembled a team of Algeria's most brilliant minds. Riven submitted to controlled feeding sessions with varying parameters, each meticulously documented and analyzed. Vaexa found herself in an unprecedented position, no longer merely a subject but a pioneer. Other Algerians regarded her with a mixture of curiosity and trepidation. She had tasted something forbidden, something that challenged their most fundamental beliefs about themselves. On the 4th day, Meralki summoned them to her private laboratory. The executive scientist's usual cold demeanor had given way to something Vaexa had never witnessed in a senior Algerian: excitement. The High Council has reviewed our preliminary findings, Meralki announced. They have authorized a limited trial program. Elindra's skin rippled with patterns of cautious optimism. That's more progressive than we anticipated. Do not mistake necessity for progressivism, Meralki corrected. Our situation is more dire than even your projections suggested. The Council simply recognizes that extinction leaves no room for ideological purity. She activated a holographic display showing various neural patterns. We've identified 7 distinct pleasure states that produce optimal feeding results. The human's method focuses primarily on one, what they call euphoric connection, but others show promise. You've been conducting additional research? Riven asked. Of course, Meralki replied. Did you think we would rebuild our civilization on a single human's theories? We've expanded significantly on your foundation. Rather than appearing offended, Riven looked impressed. I'm glad. Scientific progress requires collaboration. Meralki gestured toward a secure door at the rear of the laboratory. There is something you should see. The door opened to reveal a smaller chamber where 2 figures sat facing each other. One was Algerian, younger than Vaexa, barely past juvenile stage. The other was a tesserae, a crystalline species known for their mathematical minds and logical approach to all matters. The Algerian's feeding proboscis was connected to the tesserae's crystalline surface at a precisely calibrated junction point. Neither showed signs of distress. Instead, they appeared deeply engaged in what looked like mathematical equations displayed on a shared interface between them. What are we seeing? Elindra asked. Intellectual pleasure, Meralki explained. The tesserae experiences satisfaction through complex problem solving. The young Algerian feeds on the neural emissions generated by that satisfaction. They're working together, Vaexa observed, astonished. Symbiosis, Riven whispered, just as I hypothesized. The tesserae solves equations 37% faster with Algerian neural stimulation, Meralki added. The exchange benefits both parties. The implication staggered Vaexa. For millennia, Algerians had been feared predators, isolated from other species except as hunters. The possibility of mutual benefit, of symbiotic relationships, represented not just a biological revolution but a cultural one. The trial program will pair volunteer Algerians with compatible species, Meralki continued. We've identified 17 viable symbiotic combinations thus far. And humans? Riven asked. Humans present unique compatibility, Moralki acknowledged. Your species' neural plasticity and capacity for diverse pleasure states make you ideal partners. However, political complications, Elindra finished for her. Humans have the most reason to resist partnership with Algerians after the war. Precisely, Moralki agreed. Which brings me to the Council's decision regarding you specifically. The executive scientist's compound eyes focused on Riven. You will address the Galactic Coalition Assembly. As the researcher who discovered this possibility, and as living proof of its viability, your testimony carries weight no Algerian could provide. They're asking for my help, Riven realized aloud. They're acknowledging reality, Moralki corrected. Algerian survival now depends on changing how the galaxy perceives us, from predators to potential partners. And if the coalition refuses? Vayexa asked the question that hung unspoken in the air. Moralki's feeding spines flattened against her forearms, a gesture of grim determination. Then we face extinction with dignity. But I do not believe it will come to that. Your human has proven that adaptation is possible. He's not my human, Vayexa objected instinctively. Moralki's mouth parts shifted in the Algerian equivalent of a knowing smile. The neural scans suggest otherwise. Your synchronization patterns during feeding showed unique harmonics. There is a compatibility between you that exceeds standard parameters. Vaxa found herself unable to respond, acutely aware of Riven watching her with those unusual violet eyes. The Coalition Assembly convenes in 7 days. Moralki continued, tactfully changing the subject. You will depart tomorrow to prepare your presentation. Vayexa will accompany you as the Algerian representative. And me? Elindra asked. Luminary diplomatic credentials will prove useful, Moralki acknowledged. The Council requests your continued assistance. As they left the laboratory, Vaxa found herself walking beside Riven, suddenly conscious of the space between them. Did you know? She asked quietly. About our compatibility. I suspected, he admitted. Each feeding attempt produced different results. With you, the synchronization was immediate, like a key finding its lock. In Algerian culture, such compatibility is significant, she said carefully. In human culture, too, he replied with equal care. Between them hung unspoken questions about a future neither could have imagined days earlier. A predator and prey, now potentially something else entirely. The Galactic Coalition Assembly Hall stretched across an entire asteroid, hollowed out and transformed into neutral territory where all member species could gather. Delegates from 87 recognized worlds filled the tiered seating, their features as diverse as the environments that spawned them. Vayexa stood motionless at the entrance, overwhelmed. No Algerian had addressed the full assembly since the EI war's end 15 years earlier. Then, they had come as defeated predators accepting restrictions. Today, everything hung in balance. They're staring, she murmured to Riven, who stood beside her in formal attire designed to accommodate the presentation equipment integrated into his left arm. Of course they are, he replied calmly. Most of them have only seen your kind in security footage or historical records. You're making history simply by being here. Elindra approached, her skin shimmering with diplomatic patterns designed to convey authority and trustworthiness to the assembled delegates. The procedures have been approved, she informed them. You will present the research followed by a practical demonstration. The Assembly has appointed a verification team to confirm the neural exchanges are as described. A demonstration? Vayexa hadn't expected this. Here? Now? It was their condition for granting the hearing, Elindra explained. Words alone won't suffice. The Assembly President, a Moravian with 6 articulated limbs arranged in perfect symmetry, called the session to order. The universal translators hummed as his complex vocalizations transformed into standard language. We recognize researcher Riven Toval of Earth, presenting findings relevant to Algerian biological patterns and interspecies relations. They moved to the central platform. Hundreds of compound eyes, ocular clusters, sensory stalks, and other varied perceptual organs focused on them. Riven activated his presentation systems with steady hands. Distinguished delegates, he began. 15 years ago, this assembly ratified a treaty that regulated Algerian feeding to protect other sentient species. Today, I present evidence that this well-intentioned restriction may lead to the extinction of an entire species, and that a better solution exists. Over the next 30 minutes, Riven methodically presented his research. Data visualizations illustrated Algerian population decline, neural feeding patterns, and the breakthrough discovery of pleasure-based nourishment. As a scientist, he was in his element, precise, compelling, and authoritative. When he concluded, the technical portion murmurs rippled through the assembly. The Moravian president raised a limb for silence. The research data is compelling but theoretical. The assembly understands a practical demonstration has been arranged? Yes, President. Riven confirmed. With the assembly's permission, I will engage in a feeding session with Viexa Cortal to demonstrate the mutual benefit. Viexa stepped forward, conscious of the collective tension that filled the chamber. To many present, she represented an evolutionary horror, a sentient being that fed on others' suffering. The idea that this fundamental nature could change strained credibility. I volunteer for this demonstration, she stated formally. No coercion or deception is involved. Medical monitors descended from the ceiling as the verification team, composed of the assembly's most trusted xenobiologists, took positions around the platform. Equipment calibrated to measure neural activity in both human and Algerian physiology activated with soft hums. The demonstration may proceed, the president announced. Riven turned to face Viexa. In the privacy of laboratories, their previous feedings had been clinical affairs. Here, before the assembled galaxy, the intimacy of the act took on new significance. Ready? He asked softly. She nodded, extending her feeding proboscis from her wrist. The assembly collectively tensed at the sight of the feared appendage, the biological weapon that had harvested pain across countless worlds. Riven rolled up his sleeve, revealing the implant that would regulate the neural exchange. When Viexa's proboscis connected to it, the monitors instantly registered the connection. What followed transcended mere demonstration. As Riven activated specific neural pathways, a visible wave of pleasure crossed his features. The monitors displayed his brainwave patterns shifting to states of profound euphoria mixed with deep connection. Simultaneously, Viexa experienced the rush of nourishment, pure, untainted by suffering, more fulfilling than any pain feeding had ever provided. The verification team watched in astonishment as her biological readings showed optimal nourishment, patterns with zero distress signals from the human. When they separated after several minutes, silence gripped the assembly. The lead xenobiologist examined the readings with methodical precision before addressing the delegates. The data confirms the presentation claims, she announced. The Algerian received complete nourishment, while the human experienced intense pleasure. No damage occurred to either participant. A crescendo of voices erupted as delegates processed the implications. The president again called for order. Researcher Tovel, the assembly acknowledges your findings. What precisely are you proposing? Riven stepped forward. I propose a partnership initiative, voluntary symbiotic relationships between Algerians and compatible species, benefiting both parties. I further propose revising the treaty restrictions to accommodate these new feeding methods. And what of traditional pain feeding? A delegate challenged. Would that continue? Here Viexa moved to stand beside Riven. For the first time in the session, she addressed the assembly directly. I have experienced both methods, she stated, her voice carrying across the chamber. Pain feeding is inefficient, isolating, and ultimately unsustainable. What I experienced through this alternative was... She paused, searching for words adequate to the experience. Completion. Evolution. A step forward. She gestured toward Riven. This human didn't subjugate my species by offering pleasure instead of taking pain. He liberated us from an evolutionary dead end. A partnership between predator and prey, Elindra added from her position among the diplomatic corps. If possible, between these species, what other ancient conflicts might we transcend? The Moravian president's sensory appendages quivered thoughtfully. This assembly must consider the far-reaching implications. We will recess for deliberation. The delegates withdrew to their consultation chambers. Vaxa remained on the platform with Riven, acutely aware that their demonstration had crossed a threshold. What had begun as scientific experiment had evolved into something profoundly personal. No matter their decision, she said quietly, "You've already changed everything." Riven's violet eyes met hers. "We changed everything. Together." When the assembly reconvened hours later, their decision was not merely approval but embrace. The partnership initiative would proceed under careful oversight, with volunteers from multiple species already stepping forward. As they left the assembly hall, Vaxa glanced at the stars visible through the asteroid's massive observation dome. For millennia, her people had been feared travelers among those stars, solitary predators sustaining themselves on others' suffering. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now," Riven replied, his hand finding hers in a gesture that would have been unthinkable days earlier. "We discover what it means to evolve, not just biologically but culturally, what it means to transform from feared to valued." Vaxa looked at their joined hands, predator and prey, now partners in the truest sense. "And us?" she asked, the question encompassing worlds of possibility. Riven smiled. "I think we've already begun to answer that question." Around them, delegates from worlds that had once feared Algerians approached with cautious curiosity. Questions were asked, connections formed, possibilities explored. In that moment, Vaxa understood that they had achieved something greater than survival. They had found a path to belonging. Her species had evolved to feed on pain, but through one human's determination, they had discovered the transformative power of pleasure instead, not merely as sustenance but as connection, the most powerful force in the universe. The end,